Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Comic Source Comic Boom collaboration. Time for another Spawn Daily. We're up to issue number 40. Man, it's really going quite quickly. But at the same time, when you think about how many issues we have to go, another 290, maybe it's not going that quickly. So we're not even, maybe a 1/7 of the way. So still enjoying it. I think these comics definitely hold up. I think that they're actually improving. I'm going to nitpick this one a little bit. Tony Daniel returns to pencils, and there's, a couple things that are a little wonky, but for the most part, yeah, Spawn is really freaking good. I think it gets a bad rep. McFarlane, when he was on Spider-Man, he was just learning how to write comics, and even the early issues of Spawn had a lot of exposition, repeated a lot of the same things, and we've talked about that. Rocky and I talked about that on the podcast quite a bit. So anyway, let's go ahead and dive into this issue. Let me go ahead and share my screen. As I mentioned, Tony Daniel returns on inks. We do have him on the cover as well, which is sort of an interesting look that Spawn has here. A departure, I guess is the word I'm searching for, from what McFarlane or Capullo has done. This is a much more muscular looking Spawn. He's not quite as lithe as McFarlane and Capullo usually draw him. So as we turn to the first page, we do see, there we go, Todd McFarlane on story, Tony Daniel on pencils. Just like last time when Tony was on the book, Kevin Conrad handles the inks, Tom Orzechowski on letters. Same color artist that we had last time when Tony Daniel did the pencils, Todd Broeker, Roy Young on computer color assist. And what I'm wondering is if, because of all the detail and a little bit of a change in style that Capullo's had since he came on the book, was it just a matter of, hey, we need to give Greg a little bit of help? I don't know if that's the case or not, but it is a chance for Tony to show his chops. Another thing that's interesting, so last issue, issue 39, was a Christmas issue, and it was a lot of fun, and it didn't even advance any of the storylines, but I didn't mind it because, I love Christmas and certainly going to let these guys do a Christmas issue, and it was a lot of fun, and it had a good message. And the only thing I kind of nitpicked a little bit about was the fact that we hadn't checked in on some of the storylines in quite a while. But we did have in that issue 39, that Christmas issue, and a summary for issue 38, which was very truncated. Now, this is issue 40, but instead of having a summary for 39, which I guess wouldn't have made sense anyway, because that issue 39 is sort of, it exists obviously in Spawn continuity, but kind of as its own thing, right? It's not like it has to go, right here between these two stories. There's nothing to sort of tie it in to anywhere in the particular Spawn timeline, which perhaps that's why they didn't put any of the other storylines in it. It's just that standalone one of, which I totally, again, respect and think was a good idea. What I don't necessarily think was such a good idea was the previous two issues prior to that not touching on those other plot threads. So now we're talking about, they've gone, if you're a Spawn reader at the time that these books were coming out, you've gone 4 months, and maybe you forget, where things are going in the other storylines. But if you have forgotten, we do get the paragraph summary here, which, again, I've said before, maybe this is why McFarlane feels that he's able to sort of stop at the exposition dumps in the dialogue during the actual story, or these pages with walls of text. So we're reminded that back in issue 38, there was a guy named Chris that wandered through this mansion looking for some files on a project called Cy-Gor, which stands for Cybernetic Gorilla. It was Dr. Wilhelm's project. Dr. Wilhelm was obsessed with bringing his wife back, along with the research for the Cy-Gor. Chris actually found the Cy-Gor, tried to leave the mansion, got eaten, basically. So that recaps that portion of the story. And once I read that, when I flipped this open, okay, so I've got Tony Daniel on pencils. I've got a recap of what happened in the mansion. I got to think Cy-Gor is going to show up. Like, that's my first thought. So I guess Cy-Gor is going to show up. They're going to pick that back up. Why would they be reminding everybody if that storyline, if that plot thread wasn't going to be picked up here? We're also told about the interaction between Spawn, the one little bit of other storyline we got in that issue 38 was Cagliostro telling Spawn, hey, Jason Wynn might not be your actual target. He might not be the one who wanted you dead. So, we're told here, Cagliostro warned Spawn killing Wynn might not solve his problems. Wynn represents only a small piece of the puzzle, and we did see Spawn visit Granny Blake as she's described here. So, on the first page, I really want to call out the difference in style here for setup between what Capullo does and what Tony Daniel does. I think that sort of, it's not, how can I describe this? When you look at that skyline, those buildings, they look a little stretched out. The perspective is a little different. It's a different sort of style. I feel like Capullo's stuff is much more grounded. His skylines feel a little more realistic in a way. They have a little more bulk to them. Not that I mind the skyline at all, and I particularly love the bats that Tony Daniel throws in here. But it was just something that I noticed right off the bat. No pun intended with those bats flying there. And we see Spawn. He's walking into his alley. There's a bunch of guys around his throne for some reason, and he kind of asks them, "Hey, what the heck's going on?" And they're like, "Oh, we're just adding stuff to your throne to make it more impressive." He's like, "Whatever, get out of here. Don't touch it." And they walk off. Now, Spawn gets immediately to brooding. Commences with his brooding. He's thinking about I like to be alone. He's thinking about where he is in his life, how Cagliostro said that somebody else besides Wynn was perhaps the one that wanted him dead. Like maybe Wynn is not the guy he should be going after. There's doubt in Al Simmons' mind, and he's trying to reconcile that, right? He's thinking about how Wanda always is afraid of him, and how every time he tries to talk to her, something happens, and she sees him as this horrific monster, and he hasn't been able to connect with her. He doesn't know what to think of Terry, because the last time he was alive and he interacted with Terry was a desk jockey, is the way Al Simmons puts it. And now he's heading up security for Wynn and actually saved Wynn from Spawn. He's like, what is he doing to me? Sleeping with my wife wasn't enough. Spawn he's brooding, for lack of a better term. He's brooding. And as he's sitting there, all of a sudden, the change of his costume start to react. And he thinks, maybe it was the wine, terrible wine I was drinking earlier. He sort of ignores it to his detriment, because what we've come to realize pretty quickly here is that those guys weren't actually homeless. They weren't bums that were messing with his throne. They've actually installed these electrified tentacles which shoot out from behind the throne, wrap Spawn up, and we're told that they're specifically made to shock each tentacle, shock Spawn with 50,000 volts, which is enough to incapacitate necroflesh, or the necroplasm, right? Psychoplasm, whatever you want to call it. So this is somebody who's familiar with Spawn and is able to incapacitate them. And we see some henchmen here that look sort of like Jawas with the glowing eyes, which is kind of an interesting look. And it doesn't take them too long to literally scoop Spawn up by sticking the forks right through it, which is pretty brutal. They stick him in a box that says "keep refrigerated," and they haul him off. To where? Well, we're gonna find that out in just a couple of pages. But meanwhile, Terry Fitzgerald is talking to Wanda. This is checking in on this plot line, which I like, because I was nitpicking about that the last couple issues. But we don't really get any new information. We just get Terry and Wanda again trying to figure things out. Terry's like, yeah, they're having me look into these files. They're trying to get more information on Spawn. Spawn must have a pretty powerful reason to be messing with the government, to be messing with somebody as powerful as Wynn, but haven't been able to figure it out. Wanda, on the other hand, is speculating about Spawn. She's like, yeah, I really don't understand who he is or why he's behaving the way he's behaving. First, he saves you. We saw Spawn save him from overkill, and then he comes to me. Wanda's saying, Spawn comes to me and says that Terry's a traitor. and then he pretends to be my ex-husband, or pretends to be her dead husband, her late husband. And she really doesn't know what to think. And she's like, every time I try to take my mind off it, read a book or whatever, I'm right back trying to figure it out. And Terry's like, you know what, we need to get away. Let me, finish what I'm doing here, and we'll head out of town for a few days. I know they'll try to talk me out of it, but I'll make them understand. So yeah, it's really interesting that Wanda doesn't for a moment believe. She has that thought in her head. She did hear Spawn when he said, "Hey, I'm Al Simmons," although he didn't say those exact words. He said things that only Al Simmons would know, and she's just not buying it. So maybe it's the way he looks. Maybe it's just people don't come back from the dead. But for whatever reason, she's not buying it. So on the next page, we see a little boy who's playing hooky from school, and the sheriff pulls up and scares him away because we're told that there is some sort of creature on the loose. They're calling it Bigfoot for lack of a better term. They have found carcasses of animals killed and eaten, and they're not sure what to think. So there's a bunch of, I guess I'll call them good old boys, that are out there trying to track it down with hunting dogs and whatnot. So the last thing the sheriff wants is for this kid to get caught, by some monster. I mean, they're assuming it's a bear, I think, although they're jokingly calling it Bigfoot. So it doesn't take too long before these hunting dogs catch the scent, and the guy that has the hunting dogs, he hears his dogs, making all those noises, barking, hey, this is the signal. We found the quarry, what we were tracking, and then all of a sudden those barks and growls turned into yips, right? Which, if you've ever seen like Rambo or First Blood or anything like that, you know exactly what that means. Like the dogs have come up against something that is bigger than they are. They've gone from being the predator to being the prey. And sure enough, they say, "Oh my God, it is Bigfoot." But what actually it is Cy-Gor, right? This cybernetic gorilla, 13 feet tall, larger than life. They can kind of freeze. They don't know what to think. But the guy whose dogs were injured doesn't hesitate, starts firing at the gorilla. The rest join in. And it's interesting. We're told that the cybernetic gorilla, Cy-Gor here, he has a choice. At that moment, he can choose to attack, or he can choose to retreat. And he chooses to retreat. So you wonder who exactly is controlling this gorilla, right? Like Dr. Wilhelm was trying to create a body that was strong enough to withstand the pain of the cybernetic grafting, so that he could eventually transplant his wife's brain, or at least her brainwaves, into this body. So is it her? Is it Wilhelm? Is it somebody else? Like we're just not sure. But as the gorilla takes off, the guys call into the sheriff saying, "Hey, we found it. It was this giant ape. He blew through us. He's headed for Oak Ridge Creek." And so the sheriff heads over as well. And what we see is the little boy who he had told to go home earlier, who was playing hooky, has just relocated to Oak Ridge Creek, like, worst place he could have relocated. And there he is fishing. And so as the sheriff kind of jumps off the road there to head off this gorilla, he doesn't realize the boy is down there. And now the boy's, in the path of this off-road vehicle, about to be smashed and pulverized. But again, showing that this Cy-Gor, other than being driven to eat, and I did sort of think, well, maybe he's malevolent in some way because he ate that guy Chris, but at the same time, Chris seemed to have bad intentions, and maybe the gorilla was just starving at that point. It's sort of survival. But regardless, maybe it's just the fact that it's a kid. The gorilla actually saves the boy from being smashed. He puts up his arm, he grabs the kid. We see that he stashes him in a tree, and as this little boy is looking below, thinking, "Thanks, Bigfoot," we see the wreckage of the 4x4 there, and Cy-Gor has disappeared. Meanwhile, Spawn wakes up. Al Simmons wakes up, thinks, "Where am I?" it looks like I'm in some castle, some sort of Frankenstein stuff, and he's trying to get his bearings. And no sooner does he wake up and turn his head than he sees Curse, who we last saw a few issues ago, where Spawn had removed his cybernetic arm and had him crucified up against the wall. And Curse is basically saying that, yeah, hey, how you doing? Remember how you, left me pinned up against the wall? Well, I'm back. I know who you are. I know you're a hell spawn. I know you get your powers from hell. I know you're a holding tank for these powers and a holding tank for evil. And it's my turn, basically. You nailed me to a wall. Now it's my turn to figure out what exactly makes you tick. And I'm going to do that by dissecting you, basically. So he's already taken out some organs from Spawn. And again, he knows Spawn is made out of psychoplasm or necroplasm, so he doesn't actually need those organs to live. But he has managed to separate the symbiotic costume, which Curse says, yeah, that was a real challenge. And we see that the chains are it's a struggle to keep the chains subdued. They're showing great spirit. We see the cape is trapped in some sort of glass tube. And when Spawn looks up, he sees the lower half of his body has been removed. And Curse is talking about more than a dissection. I guess we should call it an autopsy, since you're dead. And, this is an untried procedure. It's never been done before in the Hellspawn, and we can even see the hole in Spawn's chest. And he's talking about, side effects by surgically separating parts of these psychoplasm. And he says, I'm glad you're awake, because now you can experience the grand finale when I'm going to remove your brain from your head. And we're told next issue, the conclusion by McFarlane and Capullo. So not exactly sure what Curse's end game is here, other than he's trying to find a way to get more power. That was what he was doing when he showed up the first time. That's what he's doing here. But what's not clear is why he thinks that cutting Spawn up will allow him to tap into that tank, that reservoir of power that he's talking about. So we'll have to wait and see how that all plays out. As far as the art, I don't like it as much as Capullo. I talked about it before when Tony Daniel did it. His lines are a little finer, and certainly finer than the art we get from Tony Daniel now. He does have a little bit more of a cartoony style and an exaggerated style, which is closer to the McFarlane style than the Capullo style, at least how Capullo first started off. But it's just a difference in aesthetic. The storytelling is still very, very good. The panel layouts, again, very, very good. Much like Capullo, almost like a mix, actually, of Capullo and McFarlane, because McFarlane used plenty of full-page splashes. Capullo less so. Tony Daniel is not to the point of using as many as McFarlane, but he does use more than Capullo. A lot of insets in the pages, but maybe it's the backgrounds more than anything that are just lighter than what we get from Capullo, which leaves me wanting a little bit more. Even in the castle, we do get more detailed background than in a lot of the other scenes, but still nowhere near what we get with Capullo. So the art is still very strong, and Tony Daniel's still a really good storyteller. This is, earlier on in his career, he certainly has gotten better over time. But yeah, the art is just, again, it's just a personal preference. And I do find it interesting that the first two chapters of this Cy-Gor story were drawn by Tony Daniel, but we're getting the conclusion next issue, issue 41, but Capullo is going to be on it. So that's going to be really cool to see Greg Capullo draw that cybernetic gorilla. And I'm wondering, will we get answers about who's controlling the gorilla? Is the gorilla controlling itself? Whose brain is in there, or whose brain patterns are there? Or will it be one of these things where we get a semi-resolution to the story in terms of Spawn defeats him, or Spawn escapes from Curse, or some kind of resolution with the cybernetic gorilla story, but not answers to our questions? Much like the Freak much like Curse himself until he showed up this issue. And what about Curse? Like, is that going to be wound up next issue or not? What about Jason Wynn? We saw him referenced several times, both by Spawn when he was kind of ruminating as he was sitting on his throne, also obviously by Terry and Wanda. We haven't actually seen him show up, him or the Violator. And this is another issue without Sam and Twitch as well. So what are those other storylines? When are we going to check in on some of the other characters? Although I did definitely appreciate the fact that we checked in on Wanda and Terry, and I like that we kind of got an understanding of where Wanda is at in terms of how she thinks about Spawn, that she acknowledges that he was claiming to be her husband, but she fully rejects that, her late husband, Al Simmons. And she's like, that's creepy. Why was he claiming to be Al? So really enjoy that. Another part that's interesting is Terry seems to be more engaged in actually investigating Spawn right now than in doing what he intended and was the whole reason behind him transferring to Jason Wynn's department in the first place. It's like he's, ever since Spawn attacked Wynn and then showed up at his house and scared his wife, and again, completely understandable that he would want to know more about Spawn and figure out what's going on with Spawn, being that Spawn scared the crap out of Wanda. But he has sort of set aside his other mission of, hey, let me find some dirt on Jason Wynn. You know, let me find out why, because he suspects that was who was behind the move to have Terry's life ruined, Terry murdered himself. And then the other aspect, like I said, of having Wynn and Violator show up as well, because Wynn's got that mission, if you will, from that the Violator gave him. Hey, buddy up with Terry, squeeze Grandma Blake, squeeze Wanda. When are we going to see some fruition from that? And then is there any fallout from the fact that there was a disagreement at first when Spawn attacked Wynn between Terry and Jason Wynn. Terry wanted to capture him alive. He's like, no, we can't kill him. He's more valuable to us alive. And Wynn's like, he's relieved of command. Like, is there going to be any hard feelings? Is there going to be any fallout from that? Again, we just don't know. Jason Wynn hasn't shown up. And is McFarlane trying to lessen the importance of Wynn in a way? You know, it's 2 issues in a row here. Well, not 2 issues in a row because we had the Christmas issue, but in issue 39 and now again in issue 41, we're reminded that, hey, Jason Wynn might not be the bad guy here. He was following orders when he ordered Al Simmons' death. So that's still to be explored as well. So anyway, real good stuff. Lots of continuing plot lines, but yet, you know, stories that are, I won't say freak of the week or, you know, like on Smallville, like we talked about, partly because one of them is called the Freak. But we're still being introduced to new characters too, you know, like Cy-Gor, which I think is important and helps build the mythology, and part of the reason why we're doing this, right? Because as I've said before, when we read those newer Spawn Universe titles like Gunslinger Spawn and Scorched and King Spawn, being introduced and referenced to other events and other characters in the Spawn storyline, Spawn Universe, Spawn history that I'm just not familiar with. And even Spawn himself in those books, he's very different. His personality is different. He's much more self-assured, which makes sense because I'm sure he knows much more about himself and who he is, and he's not sort of scared and trying to find his footing. But at the same time, he's a little more cold and a little more aloof in a lot of ways. So, you know, how does Al Simmons get from where he is here to that point? That's another thing that I want to understand better. So if you're checking us out on YouTube and you haven't gone over and subscribed to the Comic Source, I do encourage you to do that as well, because I put out a lot of audio-only content on that channel. So just go to your favorite podcasting app or your favorite podcasting platform, Google, iTunes, Stitcher, whatever it is, and just do a search for the Comic Source and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our New Comics Wednesdays or any of the fantastic interviews that we do. So we have an interview coming up with Jerry Conway that's going to be out in a couple days. Highly encourage you guys to check that out. Plus, we have a bunch of Best Jacket Press previews that just dropped for the latest 3 issues of that. So we have Demons #3, Clear #4, and Night of the Ghoul #4. So I encourage you to check those out as well. So That's going to do it for this episode, everybody. We really appreciate you joining as always, and we'll talk to you next time.